When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. In today's video, we are going to be doing a chapter analysis of the Mountain and the Viper chapter, and going through Tyrion's POV in this entire chapter and breaking it down. But before we get into the video, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment, please do. It helps channel grow, reach, people that might like this content as well. And let's get into the video. So the beginning of this chapter actually starts quite differently than how we see the show's portrayal of this. The beginning of Tyrion's chapter into the fight with Oberyn and the Mountain is actually the finishing of the trial. Now, Tyrion has already been made aware that Oberyn would fight for him if he demanded a trial by combat. But to start out this chapter, we see that Tyrion is extremely nervous. Like, he can feel it in his stomach, using a lot of the physical attributes that come with being nervous and stressed out. And we see that the beginning page is used to kind of show how Tyrion is still not sold on the idea, right? Tyrion is kind of weighing his options, trying to think, okay, kind of even trying to talk himself into that the wall isn't so bad, right? They have Mole's Town, it's a brothel of sorts. The, Night's Watchmen sneak off there every once in a while. And yeah, it's cold and I would be giving up my rights to Casterly Rock, but it's life. It's guaranteed life if I choose that option. But, in the back of his mind, he's thinking, can Oberyn beat the Mountain, right? Because Tyrion has never really seen Oberyn fight. He knows what the Mountain is. He knows what Sir Gregor is. So for me, it's interesting that you see the beginning of this chapter where Tyrion is kind of weighing his options going into the final part of the trial. Now, the problem either way here that Tyrion is facing is that Tyrion doesn't want to confess, right? He knows he didn't do this crime. His pride right now is really the thing that is preventing him from doing any of these options, right? Of that, maybe the wall, right? That would be the only way he goes to the wall, is if he goes, I did it, whatever, and then gets sent to the wall. He is struggling with that. Something that we see that is very much paralleled with Ned in the first book. Ned does not want to confess to things he didn't do or say that Joffrey is the rightful, ruler and lie and all this stuff. That's kind of how Tyrion is kind of feeling at this point. So I think it's interesting the way that is paralleled and drawn back to the first book. And Tyrion, that is another thing, he's struggling going into this trial. If he does go that route, he's going to have to say that he is the one that killed Joffrey. What follows is basically the Golden Cloaks come in to take Tyrion back into the trial and do all that stuff. And I think this is a very interesting thing that Tyrion does, and it's something George does that really shows you the dire situation Tyrion is in. Tyrion asks Pod, "Do you believe I did it?" And Pod doesn't respond right away. So we're kind of taking this as even Podrick, someone very loyal to Tyrion, is having some indecision about this, right? Because there's just so much evidence against Tyrion, and Tyrion's really not able to talk in this trial. He's not able to he has nothing to prove his innocence, right? So you see it. It's very difficult for anyone to believe that Tyrion didn't do this at this point. And we see him getting let in, and at the same time, we see Shay getting let in as well. Now, Shay comes in, and she starts to give her trial, right? And Tyrion, this whole time, is thinking, she ain't got nothing on me, she doesn't know anything that would damn me or whatever. And Shay plays the victim. She plays the crying girl, the girl that everyone's going to feel sympathy for. And she starts going, Tyrion was plotting with Sansa to kill Joffrey, and he wanted to be king, and he was basically forcing me to do things, that I didn't want to do, and taking his pleasure with me at all times, no matter what I thought. And he was planning to kill Joffrey and all this stuff, and basically just condemning Tyrion at this point. And Tyrion even thinks, right, she starts to cry during this performance as well. Every single person there probably wanted to hug her and, make her feel better. And that was exactly the performance she was supposed to give. And this is where I think is one of the best scenes that they changed from book to show. I think the show does this scene so wonderfully, because there are certain things that Tyrion thinks, right? He thinks, I saved the city and all of your worthless lives and all that stuff. That's in his head in the books. In the show, they do it a different way and incorporate it into his speech where he kind of breaks down. And I really like the way the show did that version of it. So what we're going to see next is Tyrion basically completely breaking down as he's just been betrayed by someone that he did care about. And another thing I want to talk about at this point is that everyone is basically laughing at Tyrion. Not only is this made worse because it's someone he cares about lying to him, or lying to people about him, and openly saying stuff about Tyrion that should have, it should be kept private. It's kind of like if you're in a relationship and you break up, right? There's just certain things you don't talk about after you break up. It's just things that are between you that are a certain trust level, right? So that is kind of how Tyrion feels at this point, where he's been kind of completely betrayed by really everyone. Tyrion in this moment feels so alone that it breaks him for a second, right? Where Tyrion's always playing this character. He's always masking kind of his emotions usually, and being this person that is kind of playing everything off as a joke sometimes. We see Tyrion come out in the next, paragraph or two, where I'm not going to repeat the speech, but the show speech is more or less what happens here, except for the stuff I talked about earlier, which I think the show does a much better job of this scene, even though it's still great in the books as well. And what I think is key here is that Tyrion mentions that he's sorry he isn't the monster you all think he is, right? Because this is the problem with Tyrion. Tyrion has painted himself as a monster and played that role for so long that, of course, people are going to believe it. Why wouldn't they believe it? And Tyrion just kind of comes to the realization that he is being judged, and something that he's always known, that because he's a dwarf, he's guilty. Because he's shorter, because he looks different than everyone else, he is guilty. There's no way he could be a human and all that stuff. And that's something we see in today's world, where there's just people in the world that if people are different than you, there's obviously something wrong with them, or they're weird, or they're this or that. And that gets into something we're not going to talk about on the channel, but yeah. And it's very tragic the way this plays out. And eventually Tyrion goes, he's not, there's no justice here, right? He is going to do a trial by combat. And Cersei's face lights up, because Cersei at this point probably thinks it's going to be Tyrion trying to defend himself, where Tyrion in the books had a plan, right? There was no, in the show, it was kind of just like, it made sense why he demanded a trial by combat, but it was kind of like lucky that he got Oberyn and all that. In the books, it's more like there was a plan here. Tyrion's backup plan, if he didn't go for the wall thing, was always going to be the trial by combat, because Oberyn had promised that he would fight for him. So Cersei right now is feeling very good. She's going to get to watch the Mountain just destroy her brother. And Tywin kind of asks, do you have a champion, Tyrion? And Oberyn steps up and says, yes, I will be his champion. And this is where you see the entire hall basically go silent and kind of hushed, because this is not expected, right? The Tyrion, the Kinslayer, the Kingslayer, he's not going to get anybody to step up for him. And here comes Oberyn. Side note, my bad. It actually wasn't Tywin that said, do you have a champion in Tyrion? It was Lord Tyrell. So yeah, just wanted to clarify that. Now, at this point, Tywin decides, okay, this will be settled on the morrow, and Tyrion is taken back to kind of his cell. And Tyrion is just satisfied with himself right now. So Tyrion, this is probably the happiest he's been in probably a good couple of weeks. Whereas, yes, he's still nervous about the trial that's going to come the next day. But at the same time, Tyrion has taken all the power from Tywin. It's something he talks about. And Tyrion is someone that constantly is known as the one that is the most like Tywin. And Tyrion in this kind of situation turns the power back in his hands, right? And it shows you the survivability of Tyrion that Tywin also has. And Tyrion kind of thinks, he's not really going to be able to eat much, which makes sense because, again, he is going to die soon if this battle goes wrongly. Can you think about how much stress he must be feeling at this point, even when he does have the satisfaction of kind of taking the power away from all these people, and seeing all the shocked faces and the horrified faces when they realized this is not going to be a cakewalk. Oberyn could very easily beat the Mountain, and then Tyrion would go free. And Tyrion even thinks about it. This is really a lose-lose situation for the realm. If the Mountain was to lose, right, Oberyn would kill the Mountain, right? And he would also inflame the the people of Highgarden, right? And also, if this was to happen, Tyrion goes free. Now, Tyrion could go with Oberyn, which is we'll talk about, and, go and crown Myrcella. That was kind of what Oberyn was wanting to do. And if the Oberyn dies, we kind of see the same thing play out, where if Oberyn dies, the Dornish people start having uprisings. And in this situation, Tyrion thinks that Doran might even crown Myrcella himself. Now, this is not the case. It's not the person Doran is, and he has another plan going on at this point. But either way, right now, Tyrion sees this as a good situation. Now, that night, which is kind of surprising to me, is that Tyrion oddly seems calm now, right? He is able to actually get a nice long sleep. He wakes up pretty refreshed. He has a nice, healthy appetite. He's able to eat pretty easily, and at this point, he seems very calm. And he then, leads kind of over to where they're going to have the trial, and Oberyn is drinking, and Tyrion's like, is this wise to be drinking? And something that we can kind of question is, was the drinking affecting Oberyn and how he kind of started to kind of boast about and put himself in a bad situation instead of killing the Mountain? Was it something that affected him? I don't think so. I just think that's Oberyn's personality, but it is something to consider. And another thing is, I think it's funny, is that it's like Tyrion, it's like, this is the Red Viper. I mean, he knows what he's doing at this point. I mean, I know that Tyrion, this is a big deal to Tyrion, but also Oberyn will die if he loses this as well. So it is interesting how you kind of see a little bit of the nerves coming out from Tyrion. And then we kind of get to a description of the Mountain, and the Mountain were described as like 8 feet tall. The dude is in full plate steel, something that like no one else could wear in the Seven Kingdoms. And he has a great sword that's usually for 2 hands. You can, use it with 1 hand for the Mountain. It's very similar to kind of like a Robert, in Robert's Rebellion. His hammer was so heavy that Ned could barely lift it. So that is kind of the description we get here. And Oberyn, asks for his spear. And also he says, I fought large men before. As soon as they go down, they're good as dead. And very good foreshadowing and kind of the thought process behind Oberyn as to when the Mountain does fall. This ain't a normal large man, Oberyn. It's not a normal dude. But, yeah, so Tyrion then also questions Oberyn on, why are you using a spear? Right? Because mostly you would see swords in a kind of a sword fight. Spears are more commonly used for a large battle and kind of using kind of how like maybe the Spartans maybe would use spears. Wasn't a very common thing when you're looking at single combat type situations in Westeros. And Oberyn kind of responds to Tyrion's question about the spear and says, well, how else am I supposed to counter this dude's reach? He's 8 feet tall. Have you seen the dude? Like, how you want me to go at him with a little sword? Like, Oberyn's significantly smaller than this guy. And it's a great plan by Oberyn, right? Use a spear, counter his kind of reach, and be able to kind of poke about him without getting too close. Because you get too close to a man this big, bad things happen. So I think that's really key. And Oberyn, it kind of shows how smart he is when it comes to military combat. And we also see in this scenario that Oberyn has thought about kind of the armor that Gregor is using. And he's like, here's the thing, you can have as much armor as you want, but there's going to be weak points at, your joints, your armpits, stuff like that, your legs. You're going to have weak points. And we see Oberyn is going to exploit that. But yeah, so the next kind of part we talked about, we kind of talked about a little bit, but Oberyn basically then says, after this is all done, I think my brother would love to have you in Dorne with your lovely wife. Now that's interesting, because this assumes that Oberyn thinks that Tyrion actually probably did it, and that Sansa he has somewhere, and that Tyrion knows where she is. It's very interesting to me on that account, but Tyrion is like, yeah, I'd be down anywhere to get me out of this city, so yeah. Also, in this, they take it a step further, and Oberyn also says, like, yeah, they're planning to crown Myrcella. Like, you come back here, we're going to talk about making Queen Myrcella a thing. We can have the Lannisters go at the Lannisters. It'd be a great time for everyone. And Tyrion kind of thinks be a lot of joy in that, watching Cersei and Tywin just be pissed out of their mind. But interesting. And then Oberyn kind of starts to talk about his family history, and we kind of see that Elia had once kind of liked one of the lords of Hightower, or the Hightowers, and that Oberyn, kind of very similar to kind of Tyrion, makes a joke because he actually ends up farting at, I guess, a table or something like that, and from there on he was given a bad nickname, and that was the end of that dude. But Tyrion thinks that, what if, you know, Elia had married this guy, right? She would have been safe. There would have been no kind of problems with the Dornish right now. That Elia would probably still be in Old Town, just having some kids. She'd be married to a pretty good dude. And it's one of those things where you think about how different really one change could affect the entire kingdoms. So really cool little history thing to bring up there as well. Which, interesting enough, is that Elia had also, Elia and Oberyn and their mother had also gone to Lannisport, something we found out in a chapter before with Tyrion. And the thing that Oberyn didn't say is that the purpose of that trip had actually been to try and get Oberyn and Elia married to the Lannister children, or one another, you know, one to the other, and yeah, you get it. And what ends up happening is Joanna Lannister ends up dying when they are in Old Town. So the thing is here that we're always told is that Joanna kind of ruled Tywin, right? She was the one that kind of would be able to get things to happen. And we see this a lot. We see this kind of with Daenerys and Khal Drogo early on in the story. And we see this in another, kind of a lot of other ways with like Catelyn and Ned, where the woman does have influence, and that's how they gain power and influence, is kind of through their husband. And when they do end up getting there, Tywin basically says no. Cersei is for Rhaegar, which doesn't end up happening. And he basically laughs at Jaime being married to Elia and says, yeah, you can have Tyrion instead. So basically, they just spit in the Dornish, like their faces basically. And you think about how different could that have been if Joanna was still alive. Because Jaime probably would have been married to Elia, and Oberyn would have probably been married to Cersei. How different would that have been? There probably would have been no incest. And then the weirdest part of this whole thing would be when Robert's rebellion ends up happening, what side does the Dornish and Lannister alliance take? That's a big one, because who would Rhaegar then marry? It's a trickle-down effect, and that's what I love when we look at some of these events that never ended up happening. What would have changed? So yeah, we get that from Oberyn right before the fight, and it's really a great like background information into the relationship that Oberyn could have had with the Lannisters. Something that I also wanted to note that I kind of forgot to say is that Oberyn's spear is also laced with poison. So not only is Oberyn playing this tactical like way where he's staying out of the reach of Gregor, but he's also just trying to get those tiny cuts in him, get the poison going in him, and then as well, you know, also just kind of slowly wounding him until Oberyn can eventually kill him. That is kind of his strategy. And we see that as the fight starts to take place, we see kind of how Oberyn plays this strategy and is kind of very agile, trying to stay away from Gregor, trying to hit his weak points. Another thing we see is that Oberyn is like very excited. He is not someone that has any fear right now. He is excited. Like he's almost like skipping to get to where they're about to fight. And Tyrion kind of notes that. And it's very interesting that we also see there's a very stark difference between the two of these people. Gregor is very heavily armored, and Oberyn is very lightly armored so that he can move around quickly and be very agile. And Tyrion kind of thinks of the strategy that Bronn said someone would have to use to kind of beat Gregor, where you'd have to kind of tire him down until he can't even lift up his arm. That's really what Oberyn's strategy is going to do, but it is very, very risky, as Bronn had stated before. And this fight kind of starts to take place. Everyone gets seated, and the fight kind of starts with Oberyn starting his taunting, starting his kind of playing with the mountain and going, do you know who I am? And it's some dead man, and, you know, it starts. Gregor runs at him, basically, and tries to slash at him, and we kind of see Oberyn taking on the persona of a snake. He has quick thrusts, right? Everything is calculated. He kind of has a little slash on his breastplate, which, again, probably has no effect, but it's the idea of what Oberyn is doing. He's very quick, he's very agile, he's picking his attacks, and the whole time, he's taunting Gregor. He's saying, you know, you raped her, you killed her, you did all this. And it's very much where you can see Oberyn is almost playing with Gregor, where he's not taking this seriously. And we'll see how that ends up playing out, as you all know. But it's very interesting the way this kind of starts, where just Oberyn is playing with him at this point, just using his spear to kind of keep a distance. Where, you know, in boxing, where the guy with the longer reach is always told to kind of jab and kind of make your presence known, to where the guy with the smaller reach has to come into you and has to put himself in a bad position where you are going to be able to punch him before he gets to you. That is kind of how Oberyn is playing this entire duel at the moment. And we start to see that Oberyn's plan is working. We're seeing that the mountain's not, you know, rising as fast. His sword is not coming up as quickly, and Tyrion notes that. And the other thing that I think is crazy is that the mountain is starting to say, basically to shut up, that this is getting to him, that he's getting annoyed now at this point. He's starting to get more tired. He's starting to get more annoyed. And what does that usually end up happening? You get sloppy. And this is where we see it. The mountain at this point starts to kind of charge, push into, you know, if we're using the boxing reference, into his fist. And Oberyn kind of puts the shield into like his right breast area and just slips it. He just slips under. He kind of slips under it. And now you have the first big hit, because we know this is laced with poison, and we have a big wound. Now Oberyn lets go of the spear. He knows he needs a new spear, basically, and kind of slips away from Gregor and takes any other slashes on his shield, because differently than in the show, where, and even on the picture on screen, he doesn't have a shield. In the books, he actually does have a kind of a tiny shield, a smaller shield, not like a big shield or anything, but a smaller shield that Oberyn uses to kind of deflect a hit here and try to get out of range. And now Oberyn's kind of out of range, where Gregor's trying to, again, get back into range. Now what's different here is Oberyn doesn't have a weapon, but he's continuing to stay out of the range, where Gregor's still trying to hit him with the greatsword. He's not in range. And eventually, Oberyn keeps backing up. He kind of runs into somebody that they're trying to get away and trying to get out of the stables. Gregor, kind of thinking this is the killing blow, swipes down and actually kills the stable boy, because Oberyn rolls away. And by the time he gets back up and Gregor's kind of got his sword off this dude, and after he's killed him and all that, Oberyn now has a spear. And we begin the second phase of the fight. And this is where we see kind of the dirty tricks and kind of the dirty fighting that Oberyn will use. Is he uses, again, this shield. This, again, is not part of the show, but he has this little shield. And we see that the sun starts to come out from under the clouds, and it starts to peek into the battle. And Tyrion notes the sun for Oberyn and the Martells, and this is what happens, right? He does kind of a feint, right? You know how boxers will do this? It's kind of a feint to go to something else, right? And this, we see that Oberyn kind of feints. It gets Gregor kind of off balance, and because the sun is coming down, uses his shield to kind of blind Gregor, because the sun is coming down on his shield, and puts it into his like slit on his helmet. This kind of blinds Gregor, and Oberyn, taking this chance, goes boom, puts the spear right in one of the joints in the armor, and that's a big one, because now you're definitely getting a really good hit here. And two, the poison, again, taking more effect, slowing down Gregor, and Gregor is very annoyed at this point. At this point, Gregor is not looking so good. He tries to kind of move towards Oberyn, and he kind of stumbles, right? You can see the blood coming out of his armpit. And this is the thing. He's wearing so much steel that if you can see a bunch of blood coming out, he's gushing inside there. And Tyrion notes that, and Tyrion realizes he's going to go down here in a second. And Oberyn had taken this time to kind of get around him. And Gregor tries to kind of spin around and try to, get to him. Oberyn kind of puts it right in his knee, and down goes Gregor. So Gregor now, at this point, is kind of on his back, like looking up, kind of on his back. And we see Oberyn, as we're seeing in the image on screen right now, basically takes his entire spear. Now, on this situation, Gregor's already on the ground, so this is kind of off the show a bit more. But in the actual books, what ends up happening is he's already on the ground, and Oberyn basically takes his spear and goes straight in him, like just skewers him straight through. And at this point, you would think he's dead. Any normal man, Gregor is dead. But this is no mere man, and as we're going to see in the last page and a half of the chapter. Now, Oberyn, again, he's over cocky at this point, where I guess he maybe should be. Gregor's all but beaten at this point, and Gregor even tries to take the spear out of him, but he can't. He's pinned to the ground. There's nothing Gregor can really do. And Oberyn decides to put his foot on the chest of the mountain, and kind of gets the greatsword, and I'm assuming he's trying to hack his head off or something along those lines, or just trying to take his helmet off, something around there, and is kind of at this point saying, you know, you can't die yet, you have to confess. And this is the point where he just gets too confident, too cocky. Gregor, in kind of an instant, like a very quick movement for someone that's very close to death, grabs him kind of under the knee, behind the knee in that, you know, area, and gets him off of his feet. And now this is where Oberyn is at a disadvantage. Even with Gregor this injured, this kind of messed up, all it took was one misstep. And how I've been saying with the boxer analogy, right? Where if you have a longer reach and you're keeping that guy at distance, right? You're using your length. If that guy gets close and it's undefended and he hits a good uppercut on you, if he gets inside, just takes one mistake and you go down. And this is what ends up happening. You know, Oberyn gets pulled down. He's kind of on top of Gregor, and Gregor is basically squishing him. Gregor is trying to pull him as close as he can, and then eventually he puts his hand up on him, and we kind of see what happens on the show version, where he just basically crushes his head. And while this whole time is going, Gregor is basically confessing to all of the crimes that he did do with Elia, with raping her and killing her children. It's a very brutal scene, and Tyrion throws up and realizes that, yep, he is now going to die because Oberyn just couldn't kill him. And that is how the chapter ends. It's kind of a shorter chapter than some of the other ones I've done, but it's one that's very packed with a lot of things going on, and I would say one of the best battle scenes in all of the entire book series. But thank you guys for watching this one. If you guys have another type of video you want me to do, another chapter you guys want me to review, let me know. And I'll try to do it as fast as I can. And I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.
If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention.